Welcome to a brand new podcast. Ian McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Ian have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Ian succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, David.
How are you?
I'm recovering from this lurgy that everyone has. It's gone on forever. 3 weeks of this, and I'm still coughing. But apart from that, I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, same, recovering from a lurgy. I don't know. I don't think it wasn't a cold sort of lurgy. It was a weird sort of headache symptom. That was the main thing. It was like a headache without the pain. It's quite unpleasant. Bit like sort of when you've been standing behind a car exhaust for too long.
Lovely.
Yeah, it felt a bit like that. It was quite weird.
I often wonder about parents taking their children on these little pram toddler things, and they stop on the pavement waiting for the lights to turn so they can cross the road. And the children, the little babies in their cots, are just the right height for the car exhaust as they're going past. And I'm sure they must be taking far greater amounts of carbon monoxide and God knows what else into the lungs than the parents are. They're 5 to 6 foot off the ground, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, something
So-
else to worry about.
So yeah, we're both moan over. We're both in recovery mode, but hopefully just about there. So this week we thought we would center on Ian and the background to TJ's story. So without further ado, should we just pile in and I'll just ask you some questions and we'll see what transpires.
God, that took forever. Go on.
Well, we'll see how it's done when you do your intro on the next one. So, I suppose the most recent thing, I was going to say start with your memories of your dad. But if we go to the other end, you said you spent decades researching your dad's life. At what point did you start to think it was more than just researching for your own interest, that actually this could possibly reach a wider audience, or at least have some meaning beyond just making sense of your background and your history?
Not during the research.
At all?
No. The research became like a hobby. I would identify a week, but I mean, early on it was whenever I could go, but as work kicked in and career kicked in and so on, I'd identify 1, maybe 2 weeks a year when I could go off and do some particular research. And all of that was just for my own benefit. It was like, I don't know, I was collecting stamps. It was just finding out more and more about what had happened to fill these holes in my head, to catch up on the blanks. But that all petered out very early on in this millennium, about 2001, 2002, because even when I started, people were getting old. The people who were in the war when I started researching were about my age now. And as I researched and talked to people, I got the sense of this generation disappearing in front of my eyes, a bit like mercury going through your fingers. So I was going out and finding these people until the last of them died in about 2002 that I could find. And then I
How did
put
how
it
did
to
you go about
bed,
tracking them
really.
down? How did you go about tracking them down?
Oh, well, that's a different question. I haven't finished answering your first question yet. So I put it to bed, and I had all the facts that I could think of about my father from pretty much when he was born through until about 1948, 49. But he continued in MI6 until at least 1960, and I was born in 1959. But what he got up to between 1948 and 1960, I never have found out.
So
And even
that
though
could have been in
my
this country,
mother,
it could have been abroad, anywhere.
anywhere, he wasn't always. He was, at home some of that time, but he would go off in operations, and my mother knew that he was in intelligence, but the way they were, he would go off and she wouldn't ask, and he wouldn't tell. So the story that I've written is up until about 1948, 49. It became something I should write about. I probably had the idea that I should write it down. I should get this story down in paper before I pop my clogs.
You must have had
I started to think like that.
huge, great folder of stuff, recordings,
Well,
notes, and
not so much stuff, because I wasn't going around to meet these people with a piece of paper and a pen. I was talking to them, and just wanting to know about my father. So I wasn't really writing very much down.
even afterwards.
So it was all in here, and I started to think about maybe writing a book about 2018. Funnily enough, I don't write a lot of books, but I started to write about a book. Started to write a book about a project that I worked on in 1990, 98, and 99, about a car manufacturing process. And in writing this book, I really enjoyed the process, and I was sending it off to an editor, and I enjoyed all of that dialogue that was going on, and that took about a year to do. I then had to work abroad, and the pandemic kicked in just as I finished that book. And so I had nothing else to do. I was, during lockdown, completely bored out of my skull. And I thought,
Where were you
I was in Saudi Arabia
for lockdown?
for lockdown. So I was able to work, but apart from work, completely locked down. And even before the pandemic, nobody was drinking alcohol, so there wasn't a lot of fun going around. That's not true. It's actually great fun in Saudi, but that's another story. So I thought, well, what can I write about now? And I thought, right, now is the time to sit down and get on with writing about my father's story. It needs to be written down. People need to know about it. And even then, I could feel a sense of, I mean, it's got much worse since then, but the world situation politically was going south very quickly, I felt. And a lot of the stuff that I picked up from researching my father's story, it seemed to be repeating itself now. So I felt a real urge to write this. And in fact, I actually wrote the book in 8 months. It just sort of poured out. And that's how it came to be written.
Yeah.
That answers your first question. Now, what was your second question?
I don't know. I've had lots of questions pop into my head while you've been talking, all of which I've now forgotten. Take us back, if you can, to some of your memories of your dad when he was alive, and your actual memories And what life was like, because you said you were 10 when he died,
Yeah, nearly 11. It was,
nearly
he
11.
died on the
So,
1st of
it
November and
wasn't
I was
like he
11
died
on the
when you were,
28th of November.
it wasn't like he died when you were sort of 4 or something, and you
No.
only have very, very sketchy memories. You must have quite clear memories of him then.
Yep. A lot of the time he was, that I experienced my father, he was drunk. Not abusive in any kind of way, just almost comatose drunk. And he would come home from the pub. We had a hotel and it was seasonal, so shut from October till March. And I remember him coming home 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. My mother had already gone to bed, my sister had gone to bed, and I'd be lying in bed waiting for him to come home. And he would get in the door and he'd have drunk so much because he'd been drinking literally all day. He'd have drunk so much that his stomach was distended. And I can remember him leaning on the wall and his stomach. And normally he didn't have that big a stomach, but his stomach was so bloated that it'd be swelling out to the wall as well. And I would help him get up the stairs and make sure that he was lying in bed. And I was 7. And I pretty much did that right through until he died. And as his drinking became worse and worse, I mean, it sounds pretty bad when I was 7, right? But as pubs in the village, there were 3 pubs in the village I lived in.
Where was this?
This is Fortrose, just north of Inverness, a place called Fortrose. And he was banned from all 3 pubs around about when I was maybe 9, because he just drank too much, and the people didn't want to serve him. Before that, they used to help him home. I can remember the landlord of one pub sort of turning up the doorstep with my father on his arm, and my mother opened the door to him, and he sort of looked at my mother. The landlord looked at my mother and said, "Well, aren't you pleased I brought him home? Aren't you grateful?" That kind of look, and you know, we weren't grateful. We didn't want these places to exist. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
So he then had to walk to the next town, which was Rosemarkie, and in those days there weren't a lot of streetlights. So for his birthday in January the 11th, 1968, I think, I bought him a torch so that he could see his way home, because otherwise he could be stumbling around in the dark. So these are all very sad kind of memories, but there are other memories. There are, in the morning, he would sober up pretty well, and I can remember times when he was standing at the sink shaving, and he'd be talking about stuff. And he said to me one time, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I rather stupidly said, "I want to be a judge." And he said, "Well, don't be a judge, be a lawyer. Lawyers help people."
What age were you then?
Say again?
What age were you for that?
Oh, I don't know. Somewhere between 7 and 8, something like that. And there were other times where he managed not to drink, and we'd go out to, when I was 4 years old, we went to the cattle market, because he was always buying and selling cattle. Loved that. And he saw me patting this pony. So about half an hour later, he picked me up and he said, "Right, come on, we better get home before the pony arrives." And he bought this pony, and it was a Welsh pony, a decent sized horse. And when we got home, the pony was already there, and my mother was horrified because there was guests in the hotel, and here was this pony eating the roses in the garden. He just, you know, didn't ask anybody, didn't check about anything, just bought this pony. And we kept it, you know. We had that pony for 33 years in total.
No.
It was a lot longer than my father did.
Yeah.
And
So
when we go to in the north of Scotland, there are Highland Games events. Various places have them throughout a sort of season. And it's not just the games, there's fairs there and lots of exhibitions and so on. And I can remember him taking us to the Strathpeffer Games, and lots of people knew him. Lots of people would come up to shake his hand and talk about the old days or whatever. There was, and typically these would be old soldiers.
So do you get the impression that his drinking from the end of the war to when he died, 1970, do you get the impression that over that period his drinking got worse?
I think it was in bouts for a lot of the time. He would have major bouts of drinking throughout the 50s and 60s, or the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that, I think drinking in bouts like that allowed him to be a sort of functioning alcoholic. But over the period that I knew him, his drinking went from in bouts to becoming continuous. And it was to get rid of. I mean, I could see it even then. I can remember thinking he's running away from something. He is really trying to block something out, and because he would give me this look of pretty much apologizing as he would go out the door at 10 o'clock in the morning. And at 10 o'clock in the morning,
really like a look of shame.
Shame, maybe, or just regret. But he would go out the door and at 10 and not be back until 11 that night, and drinking all the time. And where was the money coming from? Well, it used to come from him buying and selling cattle, but most of the time it was coming from the profits of the hotel. So after he died, within 2 years of losing my father, my mother was able to extend the hotel and do a major refurbishment because the profits were no longer being poured down the pub.
Yeah. Well, it's sobering, isn't it? At what point did you begin to, well, two questions. First one, did you have a sense then when you were 10 or 11 towards the end of whether had you realized by that point that wasn't normal?
Oh, yes.
Second half of that question, at what point did you start to piece that together with, okay, there were people that came back from the war, but and technically survived, but who were very and irrevocably damaged? Two questions, I suppose.
Okay, well, deal with the first one first. So try and hang on to the second for me. Children at school help you to realize that what's going on with your father is not normal very quickly. Right. It can be quite tough. And at primary school, I was bullied quite a bit. By the time I got to secondary, I was a much bigger boy, and anybody daring to bully me at that point tended to suffer for it. But
and presumably your father had died by the time you got to secondary school.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it was a different reaction, but my reaction when my father died was, to be honest, it was relief, because it was a real strain coping with him constantly being drunk. So your second question was, when did I piece it together in terms of this was down to the war? That was much later. What I didn't realize until I was 15 was that my father had any other kind of story. And I came across.
So let's dive into that for a minute.
Yeah.
Tell us about how you discovered that, just that dawning moment of, hang on, there might be more to this guy than just someone that disappears off to the pub all day.
Well, my mother kept a suitcase full of old photographs. And I came across this suitcase one Sunday when, I was bored out of my skull. The only thing on television was Ski Sunday, and it had just finished. So I found this old suitcase and went through it. And fairly early on in is a photograph of three men, black and white photograph of three men. One, a British Army officer with a pistol strapped to his belt. One, a disheveled German, a Nazi, with SS on his collar. And a third man in a uniform I didn't recognize. And they're in front of these gates. This Nazi has been escorted by these two men through a set of gates. And it's an original photograph. And I went to my mother and I said, "Why have we got this?" And she says, "Well, that's your dad." And I almost said, "Which one?" And
Not
I
the one in
looked
the
and looked
SS
and looked.
uniform, presumably.
Well, I looked and looked, and eventually I began to see features that I could recognize in the British Army officer. I suddenly realized, right at that moment, that I had no idea who my father was. This whole idea that he'd been in the army or anything like it was outside anything that I thought about.
And your mum
So-
hadn't mentioned anything, none of this.
No, nothing. He had my father had a gun and a pistol in a cupboard, and I knew they were there. And I think she caught me trying to play with the pistol at one point when I was 11, and so got rid of them immediately. Had somebody come along and take them away. But I just thought that was he was. Fishing rods and everything else, and I just thought that was his hunting rifle. However, and I didn't even think about the pistol. It was at that point that I realized that I needed to know an awful lot more about my father when I was 15, and I then went off as best I could to find out as much as I could about him. When I realized that there was a connection between people coming home from the Second World War and other wars and using alcohol as a means to cope. And I would think I was in my mid to late 20s when that became obvious, because not everyone who did come home from the Second World War needed to use alcohol, or some people had a very quiet war, one way or the other. They either didn't leave the UK shores, or they were in an area that didn't experience any violence at all. And some people experienced a lot of violence, but turned to religion or otherwise. I mean, for example, my Uncle Willie, who spent the entire war in Bomber Command as a navigator and went on many, many operations, including the 1,000 bomber raids and so on. He, at the end of the war, took his medals, put them in a drawer, and didn't want to talk about it at all. He suffered from real nightmares for about a year after the war, and my mother said that she could remember him screaming left, 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 right, 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 as if he was still in the middle of a bombing run. But he then went on to become a very successful businessman with a chain of hotels, and I don't think I ever saw him with a drink in his hand. He was a very quiet, stable man, had a good life. So not everyone suffered the same way.
No. Yeah,
But-
it's fascinating how people differ in their responses to these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. But there were enough people I came across who They took a lot of alcohol. Would quite easily finish a bottle of whiskey in a day.
That's pretty serious.
Many of them didn't make their 70s. Many of them didn't want to. There was a death wish. You could almost smell it. People were really sick of life because of what they'd gone through. And a lot of them didn't really want to talk about it. And some of them eventually opened up because I was quite determined. But a lot of them just kept shaking their head and walking away.
This is people that you were finding that you thought might have been able to shed light on your dad.
Yeah. I mean, quite a few of them. I don't know. Maybe if the people that I went to go and find, somewhere between 20 and 30 of the people that I found lived life as recluses. Is that the plural? Recluses?
Recly.
Well, they did. They and they were, I can remember one chap. I had to walk 5 miles. There was no road. I had to walk 5 miles to get to his hut that he'd made.
That's quite away from it, yeah.
Yeah, and when I got there, he was really quite angry, and he was apologetically angry in a strange sort of way. And I eventually walked away again. Didn't find out anything from him.
Was this when you were quite young?
That particular one, I would have been about 21, 22. Yeah. But
go on.
Well, you're asking the questions, but I was going to say that initially I started with my Auntie Jean, my father's sister, and she knew small amounts from during the war. She'd been a nurse in a hospital in Aberdeen during the war, and she would get letters from my father from time to time, and she would meet up with him from time to time, both during the war and in the years that followed. And she knew straight away that she saw the change in him straight away. And knew what he was going through because of the people she was meeting in the hospital. But she was always concerned about him, but nobody could do anything.
Was she like your main source then?
She was my original source, a sort of seed source, and it went out from there. So I got 3 names from her. One of them proved to be very useful, and a chap who lived just north of Inverness and who had also been in MI6 and had worked in a couple of operations with my father. So, and was happy to talk. He turned out to be, I didn't really appreciate just how unusual he was.
Yeah. And even if people were willing to talk, surely they might have thought, well, I can't talk about this.
They talked, but a lot of it was not quite circumstantial, but the actual operations, they would disguise, but in a particular way where I could piece together exactly what they were talking about.